past mistakes. You stated that you are not the same person that you were 20 years ago, that you've changed. Convince us that the change was a fundamental change of the heart and not just political talk. And how would you, then how would that change guide you as you serve as our nominee and our president?
Well, first of all, I don't know that I can convince you. I can be a witness, and then you have to decide whether you're convinced. I would say that I am a sadder and slower person than I was 25 years ago. That 25 years ago, I thought if you just kept moving fast enough, somehow everything would always work. And I've learned a lot of limitations of life. And that, in fact, sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes it's very painful. And sometimes you have to go to God for forgiveness, and you have to seek reconciliation, and you have to seek reconciliation with people you're close to. I don't ask people to vote on whether or not they approve of my entire life, any more than most people would want to ask whether or not people are going to vote to approve of their entire life. What I ask you to look at is a 68-year-old grandfather who has spent 53 years studying what this country needs and how to get it done, and to look at my overall record and my willingness, for example, just to endure the beating. I was told by a reporter this morning, 45% of the ads that have been bought in the state are attacks on me. Now, just the willingness to stand there and take that, because I think the future is that important, says something about which of the candidates has character and which of the candidates doesn't. And I'll let you decide whether the person who's been honest and straightforward and positive has more character than the person who hired guns to go out and run ads that are false and misleading.
Have you sought forgiveness from those who, in previous times in your life, have had issues with you?
I've talked to them, and I've tried to express my sadness at what happened, yes. And of course, in the case of my first wife, we share 2 daughters and 2 grandchildren, and have had a very, very long relationship, which Jackie has written about, and is probably the best, eyewitness to the whole process. But it is painful, it's painful. It's painful.
Do you feel like the fact that you are not running those negative attack ads personally is responsible for your drop in the polls? Do you feel like the ones that are being run against you are having an impact?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's no question. Again, he's the expert. But if you have, I don't know what the number is, $6 million, $8 million, $9 million of all of you have experienced it, robocalls, direct mail ads.
And you see, there's an attack right there. I bet Ron Paul is behind that curtain.
The other part's coming down in a second. They may want to fix that because it looks very strange on television.
Yes.
All I would say is this. I wouldn't vote for the person they're describing. I mean, you take all those negative ads and line them up and you say, wow. But here's my problem, and it's what I'm trying to work through right now. I really deeply, passionately believe that we should be worthy of our children and grandchildren, that we owe it to them to have an honest, positive debate. I don't mind debating policy. I've said my disagreements, for example, with Ron Paul over Iran. That's an honest policy discussion. But I would be ashamed to run some of the ads they're running. And I will not participate in that kind of process. And I think we as a people, not me, we as a people are going to face some very real decisions.
So you'd rather lose?
I can't be a witness to America's future while smearing my opponents. And I don't believe... And I would simply ask every Iowan before Tuesday night to ask yourself, do you really want to reward the consultants, the lies, the negativeness, or do you want to say to the country, a brand new day has arrived, our problems are big enough that we need to insist on politicians with the courage to be honest. Now that doesn't mean we have to agree with each other. This is not, some kindergarten election. But we ought to disagree on principle in public, taking responsibility for what we're doing. And I've told everybody associated with me, we are talking in a positive way. I don't mind drawing a contrast with Romney on ideology or a contrast with Paul on foreign policy, but they're going to be principled positions that all of you will have seen, there are not going to be these kind of attack ads that are frankly false.
And I have a rather broad stroke question. Living in a democracy where majority is supposed to rule, I feel like we're completely losing that. We've got so much special interest in anybody that's got a sore toe. It seems like we've got to pay attention to them instead of what the majority wants. And I'm just curious, how do you think we can turn that around?
Well, I think you put your finger on something that is much bigger than politics. A culture which loses the work ethic and a culture which loses the sense of responsibility is hopeless. And we really have to confront how serious that is. I am passionately committed to reestablishing that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I always remind people, pursuit is active. And I'll tell you a very funny story, which I frankly forgot. I said the other week, you know, in the poorest neighborhoods, where you have children who sometimes grow up in families where nobody's working, it would really make sense to have jobs in the local schools that paid them a little bit and gave them a little responsibility. And I particularly cited, Joe Klein had written years ago about New York City unions. New York City janitors earn more than New York City teachers and have contracts for how little they're supposed to do. It's a great example of union power that makes no sense at all. So we figured out, I just did a newsletter on this, we figured out that for one janitor, you could hire 30 students and pay them $3,000 each during the year. These poor children in a poor neighborhood, give them a connection to the school that keeps them from dropping out, have them learn habits like show up for work, it's your money, here's how you budget it, etc. Now, people on the left went crazy and said, you know, Gingrich wants to, you know, ruin children and destroy them and all that. So we're in the middle of this argument, and Jackie, who writes columns, called me laughing, and she said, you have forgotten that my first job at 13 was at the First Baptist Church in Carrollton cleaning out the toilets. And she said, let me tell you, I treasured every dollar I got paid because I earned every dollar I got paid. Robert is not quite as enthusiastic about this experience as his mother. But my only point is, we have to have, you need a president, because of what the mess we're in, you need a president who's a cultural leader as much as they are a political leader, because we have to reestablish patriotism, we have to reestablish the work ethic, we have to reestablish that responsibility. God endows you with rights, and by the way, God expects you to be responsible for exercising those rights.
But only, according to the CafeMom survey, only 12% of moms have faith that Washington gets it. How many of you have faith that Washington understands you? Raise your hands. I'll rephrase it. How many of you have faith that Washington understands you? Nobody.
Okay, can I make a comment?
Yeah.
I'd like to meet the 12%. I do not believe the elites in this country, this is, I think, why they're so bitterly opposed to me. I don't think the elites in this country have a clue. I think they are arrogant, they are out of touch, they lecture us, and they have no standards.
But how are you going to reinstill confidence in the future if you are attacking the institutions that are supposed to help us feel confident in the future?
I'm not attacking the institutions, I'm cleaning them out. This is like the Augean stables. Our job is to go and reestablish the Constitution. Our job is to go and insist that the Congress be competent. Our job is to go and insist that bureaucrats remember we are citizens. They are subordinate to us. We are not subjects who are subordinate to them.
Is Congress incompetent?
When you pass a 2-month extension of a minor tax cut and go home claiming victory, this is the most irresponsible Washington. The Congress and the President combined are the most irresponsible Washington I can remember in my lifetime.
Do you agree with that? One more. But half of that Congress is led by Republicans, including people who served as part of your leadership. And you're still saying they're incompetent.
I'm saying the collective, this is an anti-team. This is an institution in which the sum of the whole is less than the individual parts. Very competent, very smart people get in a room together and collapse.
You agree with this?
Yeah.
Okay.
And look, I'm not saying this happily. I mean, I'd love to be a partisan Republican and say, well, we're really doing everything right and it's all the Democrats. The fact is, the whole country's a mess right now, and the whole country's going to be faced with huge challenges, and we've got to find a language that is together. This is part of why I'm frankly so angry at the negative commercials. We have to find a way to have a presidential campaign that is an honest adult conversation about how we are going to fix our country, and you can't do that with consultants throwing mud every single day, 10 and 12 times an hour. And so you've got to think about what kind of presidential campaign do you want this year, because if we just have the same garbage we've been getting, we're going to end up with the same kind of election we've been getting, and next year will be worse, and their future will therefore be worse.
Good morning. My question is three-part. My question is three-part. If Margaret Thatcher was here in the United States and 30 years younger, would you consider her as a running mate?
Well, one at a time. That's too good a question to jump on. If Margaret Thatcher were here today and 30 years younger, I would ask her to consider me as her running mate.
Okay, do you have a Margaret Thatcher like woman in mind that you would consider?
Sure. Look, I absolutely think that we have to look for people who are very, very competent and who are capable, who are tough enough mentally to do that. I'll give you an example. I like Susana Martinez in New Mexico, the governor of New Mexico, very much. She's very smart. She's very tough. She was a prosecutor. Her husband was the deputy sheriff. They really have, and she's done a spectacular job as somebody you could imagine in that role.
What would you consider Condoleezza Rice as a running mate?
Oh, the only question I'd have is that if you've never run for office, it's a very different business. But she is very smart. Calista was with her the other week. I mean, she's very, very smart, and certainly one of the people you'd look at in terms of sheer talent and sheer knowledge. Thank you.
I have a question for you that has come up quite a bit in the CafeMom community. Our national survey showed us that while moms tend to be more conservative, they do agree with the Occupy Wall Street sentiment that government and business operate to the benefit of the 1%, and that they are part of the 99%. What do you have to say to these armchair occupiers who might not be willing to build a tent in City Hall, but agree with some of what they're trying to say?
Well, I would say the same thing I say to people in the Tea Party movement, which is the genius of the American system is you can have a huge impact by calling into talk radio, writing letters to the editor, voting, the kind of questions you ask candidates. I think people should be fairly disgusted. I want to see an audit of the Federal Reserve, which has spent trillions of dollars in secret. I want to repeal Dodd-Frank because it's actually increased the size of the banks that are too big. I want to break up Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac because they are much too big and they're out of control, and I'd like to gradually wean them off of any kind of government sponsorship. And people have every right to this. You know, when you have a former governor of New Jersey who says, you know, I don't know what happened to the $1 billion. It's just really confusing. Is there no sense of responsibility and accountability? I talked to somebody in a small town just 2 days ago who actually had some funds invested with that particular firm. And he said they're still locked up and there's still a total mess. So I think people have every right to say something is profoundly wrong about the, and I think this includes the Bush administration. The last 3 years, 08, 09, 10, and now 11, but starting in 08, what we did was fundamentally wrong because it protected the big at the expense of middle-class Americans.
Thank you. You said you would use executive powers to overturn some of Obama's policies. How can you be sure another president won't overturn your executive orders?
Well, you can't. I mean, an executive order operates within the law. So you have pretty wide latitude within the law. For example, the first executive order I would sign on inaugural day would abolish all of the White House czars as of that moment. If you elected a future left-wing president and they wanted to go in and recreate them all, they could. But that would take a positive action on their part and would not be very popular. So you can have an impact in a significant way. Ronald Reagan had what was called the Mexico City policy, which said that no American money will go to pay for abortion overseas. Excuse me. You could reinstate that by executive order. It doesn't take a law. So there are things you can do within the law that are pretty powerful.
But do you think that the president, by using, and you've been critical of Barack Obama for his use of executive orders to get around Congress, aren't you basically doing exactly the same thing?
Well, first of all,
if it's not good for him, why would it be good for you?
Any president uses executive orders. It goes all the way back to George Washington. In Obama's case, some of the executive orders, I think, stretched the law. That is, he was doing things that are right out here at the margin. But the response of Congress, if they're serious about it, is to cut off the funding. I mean, if Congress wanted to, they could say in the next appropriations bill, no money will be spent on the czars, and then have a big fight over it. And the Constitution is designed for that kind of checks and balances. So if you're going to have a president, and this is what Frank's getting at is a real question for people to think about. If you think that the wagon is in the ditch, and you want a president who is strong enough to get the wagon out of the ditch, by definition, that president's going to do some fairly strong things. Otherwise, the wagon's going to stay in the ditch. Now, that's a decision the American people have to make. I mean, if they want a timid president who operates in a way that avoids fights in Washington, that's fine. You won't have very many fights. You also won't get much changed. But if you want somebody who says, you know, I'm going to go in and I'm going to fix these things. I mean, for example, I would move on the very first day, I would move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I think it is absurd that we've said to the Israelis, they don't get to designate their own capital. Now, that's entirely the State Department bias against Israel. And there's no reason the president couldn't sign that. So there are a series of things you can do that are inside the law that nonetheless begin to reshape the government with remarkable speed.
But there, and particularly with moms, and I've done a lot of focus groups with moms, that they do have some concern that you can actually create even more chaos than what exists right now. That if you take a look at the things that you said over the last 8 months, there's so many things you're going to do on day 1, on day 2, on day 100. Is there a sense of prioritization, and could you not end up creating a battle every single day with so much chaos because of all this change?
Well, I don't know that it would be chaos, but there could be conflict. I mean, take the example we're talking about children. How many days should we wait for children to be trapped in a school that fails every child? How patient should we be to talk with the folks who don't want to get rid of teachers who literally, in some cases, have failed to educate every single child? Or how much should we say, you know, those children's lives are worth it? I mean, if you were a lifeguard and somebody had fallen in the river, you would actually have to get up and dive in. Now, that's a pretty aggressive action. Ronald Reagan thought he had saved 80-some people as a lifeguard when he was growing up. He said it was amazing how few of them were grateful. But he understood action. And I think you've got to look at, you know, when Reagan wanted to call the Soviet Union an evil empire, which he thought was very important morally and very important to undermine the psychology of the empire, they snuck it through the National Security Council because he knew that all the bureaucrats would oppose it. When he wanted to say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, which he thought was very important psychologically, they were fighting him as late as the morning he delivered the speech. Now, bold leaders who get the country moving again leave around them a sense of anxiety among people who don't want to move, don't want to take risks, don't want to fix things. And all of you have been through this in your own homes. I mean, you've all been in situations where you had to get it done. And if you didn't get it done, it was going to stay a mess. And so I think we're in for, if we're going to fix this, we're going to have several years of rolling up our sleeves together and cleaning the place out. And it's a little bit like remodeling a house or spring cleaning. I mean, some of it will be a little messy, some will be a little confusing, but I think together we'll get it done.
Moms
Yes.
are so frustrated right now with this unwillingness to compromise that they see in the Congress. Can a bold leader also compromise with other branches of government and find solutions and not end in a stalemate?
You don't necessarily have to compromise, but you have to find a way to have a win-win system. That is, if I want to get what I need, I've got to find out what you need. This is what Clinton and I did all the time. We'd have conversations and say, I have to have this, and I can't do that. And he'd say, well, gosh, I have to have this, and I can't do that. And so you begin to try to figure out, is there a formula that brings you together? I'll give you a minor example that I just find sort of amazing. Senator Webb and Senator Warner are two Democrats from Virginia. They've introduced a bill that would allow the Commonwealth of Virginia to develop oil and gas offshore. And it fits every Republican value. It would increase revenue to the federal government, it would increase revenue to the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, and it would increase revenue for infrastructure and for land conservation. And I've been trying for 4 months to convince the House Republicans, just pass the bill. It's not a compromise, it's exactly what Republicans say they're for. Send to the Senate a Democratic Senate bill. And then Harry Reid's got to say to his two Democratic senators from Virginia, I'm not going to let you bring up your bill that the House Republicans just passed. There are ways to work together that don't necessarily mean you compromise any core principles, but you understand each other and you figure out how to find an agreement that lets you move forward. I did it with Reagan in the early 80s when Tip O'Neill was Speaker. I did it as Speaker when Bill Clinton was President. We could never in either period have gotten a purely partisan solution. It would not have happened.
My name is Billy Brothers, and I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. And my question is, what is your plan for Obamacare?
My plan for Obamacare, if you go to newt.org, the very first thing under the Contract with America is to repeal it. And I think you then have to replace it with a program that is more focused on doctor-patient relations and your pharmacist and the people you rely on. I want to get power away from both the government bureaucrats and the insurance company bureaucrats and get back to doctors and patients.
And what do you replace it with?
I think you replace it with a system which is much more localized and where people have many more choices, and you don't have Washington bureaucrats writing, multi-thousand-page regulations. There are more regulations in healthcare than there are at the Internal Revenue Service.
Do people have the right to quality health care?
I think we as a country want every American to have access to quality health care. Just because none of us want to see somebody dying in the streets. But that doesn't mean that they have to have health insurance, and it doesn't mean we have to do it stupidly. And I'll give you one single example. An amazing percent of the poor people who go to emergency rooms don't have an emergency. If you simply put the equivalent of a minute clinic right inside an emergency room door, you can literally triage and say, well, you're an emergency, you go over here. You need 2 aspirin, you go over here. You save about 80% of the cost of an emergency room by that simple model, just using common sense at a local level.
Thank you for coming today, Mr. Speaker. When the government was on the verge of a shutdown, those of us in the military were among the first to face the repercussions. If there was to be a government shutdown, how would the military be affected if you were president?
Well, let me say, first of all, I'm very proud of you for wearing that uniform. My father wore that uniform for 27 years in the infantry. I grew up in Army bases around the world. I thought it was, this goes back to our conversation about how bad Washington is right now. Bill Clinton and I had some terrific fights, and we twice closed the government. We didn't affect the military, the air traffic control, the FBI. We didn't affect Social Security because we designed the dance to not be stupid. These guys have done the opposite. They've tried to maximize the pain in order to win their way. I mean, it's really, truly bad government. So I would say to you, first of all, I hope we would not get to that. But if we did get to it, I would introduce legislation and ask them to pass legislation to exempt all public safety personnel and to exempt Social Security so that you didn't have those engaged in the fight. We should be able to have a fight over here, over policy, without crippling our institutions and leaving people who already have enough to worry about. I mean, military families shouldn't have to worry about whether or not they're going to get their next paycheck because Washington politicians are stupid.
And before you sit down, and what about that paycheck? Because they're talking about significant cuts in military spending. What about veterans benefits? And what about those who are serving our country right now?
I'll just say to all of you, this probably goes against the tide of the current beliefs in Washington. You are not 5 years from now going to have significant cuts in military spending unless we are running huge risk in our national security. You can't live in a world in which China is modernizing, in which there are radical Islamists who want to kill us, in which the North Koreans have a nuclear weapon and the Iranians are trying to get a nuclear weapon, and the Pakistanis may well have well over 100 nuclear weapons. And if we cut on the most expensive military you can have is a cheap military that invites a war. And we need to decide we're going to be the strongest country in the world, and that is the first duty of government, is to remain that strong.
When I was here in Iowa, and I don't think you were expecting the question, and I don't think you're going to expect this one, I asked you to talk about a moment in your life, whatever moment you wanted to, that had an impact on your policies and on your beliefs. This is a group of moms here. When you think of your mom, what special moment comes to mind that gives you, I know that she's not still with us, what moment do you think of when you think of your mom?
Well, I mean, first of all, you'll get me all teary-eyed. Calista will tell you, I get teary-eyed every time we sing Christmas carols. Yeah, it's hard to do. Excuse me. My mother sang in the choir and loved singing in the choir. And I don't know if I should admit this, but when I was very young, she made me sing in the choir. And we had pictures of me at a very early age singing in the choir. But I identify my mother with being happy, loving life, having a sense of joy in her friends. But what she introduced me to is late in her life, she ended up in a long-term care facility. She had bipolar disease and depression, and she gradually acquired some physical ailments. And that introduced me to the whole issue of quality long-term care, which I did with Bob Carey for 3 years. And then that introduced me to Alzheimer's, which I did with Bob Carey for 3 more years. And my whole emphasis on brain science comes in directly from dealing, see how I'm emotional, from dealing with, the real problems of real people in my family. And so it's not a theory, it's in fact, my mother. I do policy much easier than I do personal.
And they're going to be mad at me. But if she were here today, what would you tell her?
If she were here today?
Yes.
Oh, she'd be talking to all these people. She wouldn't, and she'd be telling them how nice I was. And what she was very proud of me most of the time.
And what would you?
Not all the time, most of the time.
And what would you say to her?
She spent 27 years as an Army wife. And she was in a culture that valued patriotism, duty, took a risk for this country. And I would say to her that I will do everything I can as a candidate to be worthy of ourselves.
Do you have another mom question? We have about 4 minutes left, and I apologize. I did not mean to put you through that. But they're
very helpful.
Yes. And they're free, so that makes it.
No. Well, that's a sign you haven't had children.
How would you like to close, knowing that there are not just a lot of moms in this room, but a lot of moms who are watching you right now, and a lot of moms who are connected through CafeMom? What would you tell them that they need to think, that they need to do, and they need to hope for, not just on Tuesday, but for the rest of this election cycle and going forward?
Look, I think women in general, and moms in particular, bear the brunt of the economy. When the economy is bad, a greater part of the pain is borne trying to figure out what to do and how to do it by mothers and by women in general. It's the way that the culture has worked. Mothers also cared more deeply and worry more deeply about their children. One of the most powerful comments I ever heard was a focus group that was done in Cleveland about national security and why people are so worried about things like the Iranian nuclear weapon. And it was a mother who said on the morning of 9/11, she had 3 children in 3 different schools. And she had to decide which one to get first. She said she would do anything to never do that again. So I think whether you're talking about the economy, you're talking about security, or values. I mean, mothers are the civilizing influence. I mean, look, we all get it. You think these 2 guys and me are the civilizing influence? No hope. And mothers play an enormous role in sustaining civilization. And that's why I think mothers probably understand the threat of a devalued, uprooted America more deeply than men do. And so I would simply ask folks, if I could put it in a very simple way, I would ask you to think about how much you love your children and how much you love your country. And try to help people like me figure out how do we get the news media and the candidates to understand that they really should participate in an election worthy of our children and worthy of our country, because we are in real trouble and we can't stand politics as usual. That's what I want.
We really appreciate you joining us here in front of all of these moms. And we're going to be talking to more candidates in the coming weeks. You can keep tabs on what we're doing at momsmatter2012.com. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
These are his grandchildren. And if you all want to come up and grab a photograph or shake hands, here's your shot to do it. Yes.